Most people think they know how the Korean War started. They picture a single dramatic morning, June 25th, 1950, when North Korean tanks poured across the 38th parallel without warning, and a peaceful South was suddenly invaded by a communist aggressor backed by Moscow. It's a clean story with a clear villain, the surprise attack, and a clear turning point, the tanks rolling south at dawn. But here's the problem. That story is dangerously incomplete, and in some ways, it's flat out wrong. The invasion of June 25th did not cause the Korean War. Let me say that again because it matters. The invasion was the spark, but the real structural damage, the political and economic pressure building for over 5 years before a single soldier crossed the parallel, had already made war almost inevitable. What actually caused one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century is a far darker, more complicated, and more human story than you've been taught. It involves a hasty line drawn on a map by two American colonels who had never been to Korea. A speech in Washington that accidentally told the world exactly where America wouldn't fight. A rebuilding of Japan's economy that quietly required a war next door to make it work. A civil war disguised as an international one. And a superpower in Moscow that said no for years, then suddenly said yes. The Korean War wasn't simply an invasion. It was assembled piece by decisions made in Washington, Moscow, and Tokyo by people who mostly believed they were managing a crisis, not causing one. And the most unsettling part is that the same pattern, drawing careless lines, signaling weakness without meaning to, letting economic interests quietly shape military ones, has repeated itself in nearly every proxy conflict since. So let's go back, not to June 1950, but much further. Because the true origin of the Korean War doesn't start with an invasion. It starts with a map drawn in about 30 minutes. In August 1945, Japan's sudden surrender caught the United States almost completely off guard in one specific way. Soviet troops were already pouring into Korea from the north, having declared war on Japan just days earlier, and American forces were still hundreds of miles away. Washington needed to figure out, immediately, how to divide the responsibility of accepting Japan's surrender across the Korean peninsula before Soviet forces simply occupied the entire country. Two young Army colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were given the task late one night at the War Department. Neither man was a Korea specialist. Working with almost no preparation and a National Geographic map, they picked the 38th parallel, a straight line of latitude that conveniently placed the capital, Seoul, in the American zone. Rusk later admitted the decision was made in roughly 30 minutes, chosen mainly because it seemed reasonable and because no better option was immediately obvious. It was intended as a temporary administrative boundary for accepting Japanese surrender. Nothing more. The Soviets, to Washington's genuine surprise, accepted the line without objection. Nobody involved on the American side expected that acceptance, and nobody involved treated the 38th parallel as a permanent political border, because it was never meant to be one. But temporary lines drawn under pressure have a way of hardening. Within 3 years, two entirely separate governments had formed on either side of it, each claiming to be the legitimate government of all of Korea, and each openly hostile to the other's existence. Here is where the story gets far more complicated than North invaded South, because both governments that formed on either side of that line were led by men who were actively trying to provoke a war of unification, not prevent one. In the South, Syngman Rhee, an anti-communist nationalist who had spent decades in exile, largely in the United States, took power in 1948 following elections that Rhee's opponents and many international observers considered deeply flawed. Rhee ran an authoritarian government that violently suppressed leftist uprisings, most notably on Jeju Island, where estimates of civilians killed by South Korean forces and allied paramilitaries range into the tens of thousands. Rhee repeatedly and publicly stated his intention to reunify Korea by force, telling American officials on multiple occasions that, given sufficient military support, he intended to march north. In the north, Kim Il-sung, installed with Soviet backing after building his political career, partly as a guerrilla fighter against Japanese occupation, was equally committed to unification, but from the opposite direction. Kim spent 1949 repeatedly lobbying Stalin for approval and military support to invade the South, arguing that a rapid strike would trigger a popular uprising against Rhee's unpopular and repressive government. The historian Bruce Cumings, whose research on the origins of the Korean War remains among the most extensively documented in the field, has argued that describing the conflict as simply North invades South obscures a deeper reality. This was, at its core, a civil war between two Korean governments that had both been actively provoking border skirmishes along the 38th parallel for well over a year before June 1950. Official U.S. military records document literally thousands of border clashes between North and South Korean forces throughout 1949, some involving battalion-strength units and artillery, with casualties on both sides numbering in the hundreds. The invasion of June 25, 1950, was not the start of the violence. It was an escalation of a civil conflict that had already been running hot for well over a year. Now let's talk about the moment that historians argue may have done more to enable the invasion than almost any single Soviet or North Korean decision. A speech delivered in Washington by U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, the very same Dean Rusk's boss, on January 12, 1950. In an address to the National Press Club outlining America's strategic defensive perimeter in the Pacific, Acheson described a line running through Japan, the Ryukyu Islands, and the Philippines. Korea was conspicuously left outside that perimeter. Acheson's larger point was nuanced. He argued that areas outside the direct defensive line would rely on collective UN response rather than unilateral American military commitment, and this reflected genuine pre-existing American military planning. U.S. combat troops had, in fact, already withdrawn from South Korea in 1949, leaving behind only a small military advisory group. But nuance rarely survives translation into intelligence briefings. Declassified Soviet and Chinese archival material, made available after the Cold War, examined extensively by historians, including Cummings and William Stueck, indicates that Acheson's speech was specifically cited in Soviet and North Korean internal discussions as evidence that the United States would not intervene militarily if the North attacked the South. Stalin, who had rejected Kim Il-sung's request to invade multiple times throughout 1949, reversed his position in early 1950, shortly after Acheson's speech, and shortly after the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb the previous August, which fundamentally altered Stalin's calculation of how much risk he could tolerate in confronting the United States indirectly. This is the part conventional history tends to flatten into a footnote, but it deserves to be the centerpiece. A speech intended to describe existing defense policy in the Pacific was interpreted, whether accurately or not, as an invitation. And within 5 months of that speech, tanks were crossing the parallel that Acheson had implicitly written off. Here's where the story takes its strangest and most underexplored turn, because the origins of the Korean War cannot be separated from a decision made almost entirely for economic reasons: the American reconstruction of Japan. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, U.S. occupation policy in Japan, overseen by General Douglas MacArthur, initially focused on demilitarization and breaking up the large industrial conglomerates, the zaibatsu, that had powered Japan's war machine. But by 1947 and 1948, as the Cold War intensified and China's civil war increasingly appeared headed toward a communist victory, Washington's priorities shifted sharply. This shift became known informally as the reverse course. Instead of weakening Japan's industrial base, American policymakers, most notably a banker and economic advisor named Joseph Dodge, who was sent to stabilize Japan's economy, pushed to rebuild it rapidly, positioning Japan as the industrial anchor of a non-communist East Asia. The logic, laid out explicitly in State Department planning documents from this period, was that a strong, stable capitalist Japan required regional markets and trade partners to sustain its recovery, and it required a defensible perimeter of non-communist states nearby to prevent Soviet or Chinese influence from spreading into a rebuilding, still fragile Japanese economy. Korea sat directly in that calculation, both as a market for Japanese goods and, more urgently, as a buffer. A communist-controlled Korean peninsula, sharing a narrow strait with Japan, was viewed by American strategic planners as an unacceptable risk to the enormous investment the United States was making in Japan's economic reconstruction. This is a critical piece of context almost entirely missing from popular retellings of the war. American intervention in Korea, once the invasion happened, was driven not purely by a commitment to South Korean democracy, which was itself fairly shaky, but substantially by the imperative to protect the economic and strategic project underway in Japan. There's one more piece of this puzzle that sits almost entirely outside the popular narrative, and it's arguably the most important: a classified strategic planning document known as NSC 68, completed in April 1950, 2 months before the invasion. Drafted primarily by Paul Nitze at the State Department, NSC 68 argued that the Soviet Union was fundamentally expansionist, and that the United States needed to dramatically increase military spending, potentially tripling the defense budget, to credibly contain Soviet influence anywhere in the world, not just in Europe. At the time it was drafted, NSC 68 faced significant internal resistance, particularly from budget-conscious officials in the Truman administration, who balked at the scale of spending it proposed. It was, in the spring of 1950, a contested and unfunded proposal. The invasion of South Korea in June 1950 changed that instantly. Historians, including Cummings, have pointed out that NSC 68's recommendations, still sitting on Truman's desk with no clear political path to approval, were essentially validated and rapidly implemented once war broke out. Defense spending in the United States nearly quadrupled between 1950 and 1953. This doesn't mean the war was manufactured to pass a budget document. That would be an overreach the evidence doesn't support. But it does mean that when the invasion happened, there was already a fully drafted, previously stalled framework sitting in Washington that reframed the entire conflict within days as exactly the kind of global test NSC 68 had warned about. And that framing shaped how aggressively and how permanently America chose to respond. By the time North Korean forces crossed the parallel on June 25, 1950, virtually every structural precondition for a major war was already in place. A hastily drawn boundary had hardened into a genuine political division. Two Korean leaders, each backed by a superpower, were actively seeking to unify the peninsula through force, and had already been fighting a low-grade border war for over a year. Stalin, newly emboldened by a successful atomic test and reading Acheson's speech as a signal of American disengagement, had reversed years of caution and given Kim Il-sung the green light he'd been requesting since 1949. Washington's strategic planners had already concluded, in a then unfunded document sitting on the president's desk, that communist expansion anywhere needed to be met with overwhelming resolve. And an enormous, still fragile American economic project in Japan meant that a communist Korea sitting just across the strait was, in Washington's calculation, not a regional problem, but a direct threat to a core Cold War priority. President Truman committed U.S. forces within days, framing the intervention publicly as a stand against communist aggression and a test of the newly formed United Nations' willingness to resist armed conquest. China entered the war that October, after UN forces pushed past the 38th parallel toward the Yalu River, viewing an American-aligned government on its border as an intolerable threat. What began as a Korean civil conflict became, within 6 months, a direct military confrontation between the United States and the newly formed People's Republic of China. Now let me bring all of these threads together, because the true complexity of the Korean War's origin is not any single cause, but the way multiple decisions, made independently and mostly in good faith, locked together into a war that both superpowers had, at various points, tried to avoid. You had a boundary line drawn in 30 minutes by two officers with no expectation it would become permanent. You had two rival Korean governments, each authoritarian in its own way, actively pursuing forced reunification and fighting an undeclared border war for over a year before the invasion. Most people consider the war's start. You had a speech meant to describe existing military posture that was read in Moscow and Pyongyang as a green light. You had an American economic reconstruction project in Japan that quietly transformed Korea from a peripheral concern into a strategic necessity. And you had a sweeping, previously stalled strategic doctrine sitting in Washington, ready to instantly reframe a regional civil conflict as a global test of containment the moment the shooting started. Each of these factors alone might have produced a contained, forgettable border skirmish, and in fact, similar skirmishes had already been happening for over a year without triggering full-scale war. Together, they produced a conflict that killed an estimated 3 to 4 million people, the overwhelming majority of them Korean civilians, and set the template for nearly every proxy conflict of the Cold War that followed. What historians and popular retellings get wrong time and again is compressing this into a single morning in June, a surprise attack from an aggressor state. That framing isn't just incomplete. It obscures the reality that this was a conflict multiple governments had been actively working toward for well over a year, shaped as much by a badly interpreted speech and an economic reconstruction plan in Tokyo as by tanks crossing a line on a map. When we talk about 3 to 4 million dead, those numbers don't capture what it actually felt like to live through it. They don't capture the families in Seoul who fled south as the city changed hands 4 separate times over the course of the war, each occupation bringing its own reprisals against anyone suspected of having collaborated with the other side. They don't capture the estimated hundreds of thousands of Korean civilians killed in mass executions carried out by both South Korean and North Korean forces against suspected political enemies, executions that, in the South's case, were documented decades later by South Korea's own Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They don't capture the American bombing campaign in the North, which destroyed the overwhelming majority of North Korea's cities and infrastructure, a level of devastation Air Force General Curtis LeMay later stated openly, in official post-war testimony, had killed a substantial percentage of the North population through direct bombing and the resulting famine and disease. They don't capture the roughly 10 million Korean families that were permanently separated by the final ceasefire line in 1953, many of whom would spend the rest of their lives, and in many cases die, without ever seeing their relatives on the other side again, since the two Koreas remained formally at war, with no peace treaty ever signed, all the way into the present day. This is a pattern that should feel uncomfortably familiar to anyone watching how proxy conflicts unfold today. A local political rivalry, absorbed into a larger superpower competition, becomes something neither original participant can fully control. A public statement, intended as one thing, gets read by an adversary as a signal of something else entirely. Strategic doctrine, drafted in advance and waiting for a justifying event, reshapes how a conflict is understood and responded to almost overnight. And economic priorities, quietly, end up shaping military commitments that get publicly justified in the language of values and defense. The conventional story of the Korean War is comforting in a way. It tells us a communist state launched a surprise invasion, and the free world responded. It implies the war began on a single identifiable morning, with a clear aggressor and a clear defender. But the real story is far less reassuring. The real story is that the war was the product of a boundary nobody intended to be permanent, two governments that had both been trying to start it for over a year, a speech that was misread with catastrophic consequences, and an economic reconstruction project on the other side of a narrow strait that quietly turned a regional civil conflict into a line no superpower felt it could afford to let the other cross. That's the real lesson of the Korean War's origin. Not that wars begin with a single act of aggression, most don't. The lesson is that by the time the first shot that historians point to is actually fired, the war has usually already been decided by a dozen smaller decisions made months or years earlier by people who mostly believed they were managing a crisis, not creating one. So the next time someone tells you the Korean War started because North Korea invaded the South, you'll know better. You'll know that invasion was the visible eruption of pressures that had been building since a line was drawn on a map in 30 minutes, 5 years earlier. If this story reshaped the way you think about how wars actually begin, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. We go deep on the forces that actually move markets, nations, and the global order. The kind of stories that don't make the evening news but quietly shape the world you live in. Drop a comment below with your take. Was it Acheson's speech, Stalin's reversal, or the economic priority placed on Japan that mattered most in setting the Korean War in motion? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who care about understanding how power and history actually work. I'll see you in the next one.